All right, let's talk about Angular components. All right, so we just created a hello world component from scratch, right? We imported the component, we created the class from scratch, we exported it, we annotated it, and then we had to declare it in the app.modules, and we did this all by hand, yes? So that was the only time we're ever going to do that by hand. Instead, we're going to be using the ng command line interface, right? This command line interface can create components for us. I mean, it's very cumbersome. We have to create 4 files for every component. It's much easier in React. I can just create 1 file and it's a JavaScript file, and I'm done. So the ng tool is going to simplify that. I can create a brand new component by saying ng generate component and then the name of the component. So here's my second try at a hello world. I'm going to call it hello world 2. When I do this, the tool is going to generate the 4 files for me. We create a CSS file, the spec file, the HTML, and the TS. And notice the naming convention, right? It takes the name that I gave it, and then it appends component to it. See that? Right, again, that's a very common naming convention in Angular. Also notice what it does. It creates a directory for me. So each component is going to live in its own directory that includes these 4 files. Yes? Right? We're going to be spending most of our time in the HTML and the TS, right? Which roughly equate to in a React application where the TS is kind of like the container, yes? And whereas the HTML, it will be our stateless component, right? Right? Again, the HTML is mostly just stateless, right? You just pass it some state variables. It can iterate and it can take a look at the take a look at the variables and then generate dynamic content, right? But it has no code inside of it, right? The component typically any event handlers, it would invoke those functions, pass to the properties, right? Same thing with the HTML. The HTML has no functions, right? It can refer to state variables and then render them dynamically in the HTML using special Angular specific attributes. Whereas TS is going to have all the event handlers. It's going to maintain the state of the application, just like a container does in React, right? A container in React has this.state, right? It declares a whole bunch of functions, delete this, create that, update, and whatnot, yes? Right? And it updates the state as it interacts with the application. So the same thing, the TS is going to have its own state. Everybody good? So roughly, that's the mapping. So in our template, we already have the when we create this component, it creates for us already some dummy content for all of these 4 files, right? For instance, in the HTML part, it just creates a simple span HTML that says, "Yep, Hello World 2 is working." That's literally what we'll say. Some default dummy content. It will also create some dummy content for our component. It will already do all the correct imports. It will declare our class. It will export it. It will create a constructor for us. It will do an ng init. One of the the equivalent of component did mount, right? It will create one of those functions for us, right? So let's take a look at this. All right, so in the app.component, we can replace our first hello world with our new hello world, and we can update the content of the HTML to just say hello world 2, right? And then if we refresh, we see that indeed is rendering as hello world 2. The component itself, if we open up the component, we'll see that by default the tool will have correctly exported the class. It will have created a name for our class based on the name that we gave it, correctly capitalized. It will have declared an empty constructor. It will also have declared an empty ng on init. Right? ng on init is the equivalent in React of doing a component did mount. Right? It's one of many lifecycle methods that get invoked at different times as the component is rendered and it's added to the DOM. Yes, right. The constructor is the equivalent of a constructor in a React component, and also implements on init. Notice that this is another abstraction that that TypeScript adds is interfaces. Not only do we have classes, but also we have interfaces. Very much like we would have interfaces in Java, right? These are where we can declare all sorts of functions and with their signatures, right? And make sure that that classes that implement us have those functions implemented for us, right? So that's one validation that allows us to guarantee that our class can play nice with the infrastructure, right? So this on init declares one single function called the ng on init function. So here's our declaration. Here's our implementation. It's an empty declaration, right? It's not doing anything, but we want to make sure that we are implementing this interface. All right. So here's an example of state variables, right? In React, the way we maintain state is by using this.state, right? And then declare a JSON object, yes? And whatever we put in that JSON object is the state of the component. And then we can refer to it by using this.state or whatever. We refer to the variables in the state. Yes. In Angular, it's a little more. I think it's a little easier. You just declare variables on your component, right? Any variable that you declare at the top level of your component, it's a state variable, right? And whatever you do to that state variable, it can be that state variable can be referenced from the template, from the HTML. They're tied. Whatever you do to that variable, it immediately is rendered on the HTML, okay, and on the template. And the way you refer to each other is by using these funny-looking curly brackets. Two curly brackets, right? Sometimes referred to as mustaches. They look like sideways mustache. So this variable message, right? It's tied to the state variable message. You see that? This will render this content, hello world component. Right? The only difference here from React is that React uses a single curly bracket, Angular uses double curly brackets. All right. Other than that, you can put inside of the double curly brackets the same thing that you can put in a React single curly bracket. It's a JavaScript expression, right? You can have ternary functions in there. You can have arithmetic. You can have all sorts of an expression that can dynamically calculate something, right? In this case, it's just a single variable that gets rendered as just hello world component. Everybody good? All right. A little bit how the data flows. We have the component that has the TypeScript declaring a state variable equal value, and then being referenced from the HTML template, by the name of that variable, and then when it gets rendered into the DOM, right, it gets replaced by the value of variable dynamically when it's rendered by the DOM. Make sense? Right?